come back in another 20 minutes. Okay? That's how we've always done it. Don't listen to that. Don't worry about snapping. I'm very articulate. I'm very sharp. Okay, Charles is here. Katie's here. God save the king. Let's go. Showtime. And this is available on stream. YouTube. They sent the link. Did you guys get it? We are IBM. We are the best. Thank you, Mr. March. And Mrs. March. For taking me from politics. It used to be a security guard. That's why I fight so hard. Oh, I also interned for the New York Civil Liberties Union. I did. Good to see you, sir. You look very handsome. Prince is going to get a check tonight, baby. You know that. Okay, good boy. I just want to see Professor Michael Pollack. That's what I'm here to say. Okay. Is that Professor Pollack? Cardozo Law School. God bless you. Class of 2017. You know Michael Garcia? Professor Wu? Those are my people. Yes, they are. First he gave me 5 credits of patent law. You gave me some. You should know Professor Bacafusco too. Oh, I love that. Yes, he taught me copyright law. Let's get it.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Say hello. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're a hearty bunch who showed up here. Congratulations to you and thank you. And thanks also to the, I'm told, 1,200 people who are watching us on live stream. So we have, in fact, quite a nice audience. Welcome to America in Crisis. Why American Democracy is in Crisis Right Now, brought to you by the New Republic and the American Civil Liberties Union. We're going to have a great conversation tonight. Actually, we're going to have 4 great conversations. I'm looking forward myself to watching them and participating in one of them. I want to thank the ACLU, our partner here tonight, without whom we couldn't have had this evening. I want to thank Wynn McCormick, the owner of the New Republic. I want to thank my friend Michael Cardozo, the publisher and CEO. And I want to thank Kim Blanchard, our marketing director, who did so much work to put this together. I'm just going to say a few introductory words. I don't think this crowd probably needs me to tell you about the crisis that American democracy is in. I will just say 2 things. It's worse than I ever thought it could be. I don't want to say exactly how old I am, but I'm old enough to, let's put it this way, with the Super Bowl around the corner, I have a living memory of when the New York Jets won it. So I'm that old. And, you know, I never thought in my life that this country would be in this position. We've seen countries lose their democracies. We saw it happen in Chile, Argentina. It happened in the countries of Eastern Europe in the late 1940s for 43 or so years, depending on the country in question. I never imagined we'd be in a position in the United States where we were seriously thinking that we might lose our democracy in this country. But lo and behold, we find ourselves in that position. The 4 or 5 things, I think 5 things really, that we're talking about tonight are voting rights, abortion rights, the Supreme Court of the United States, issues related to censorship, and finally the processes and institutions of our democracy. These things have been under attack for some time, really. The takeover of the Supreme Court long predates Donald Trump, for example, attacks on voting rights and all the rest. But they've all been accelerated in the age of Trump until we've gotten to the point where we are. It's a very frightening time and a time when we're really on the precipice, and we're here tonight to probe that and to also to see what we can do about it. And that leads me to my second point, which is that I want to emphasize that this is not, bleak though the times may be, this is not a time that we should be in despair. A little part of me despairs every day for anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours. about the situation that we're in. But I always manage to snap myself out of it and tell myself this is not the time to despair. This is the time to fight. We're fighting at the New Republic every day. And by the way, I hope you'll come and read the New Republic. A lot of you probably think, oh, I subscribed to that back in the 1980s or 90s. Well, try it again. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. And come to TNR.com and have a look around. We're fighting. I know our friends at the American Civil Liberties Union are fighting, and I know all of you are fighting. That's why you're here, and that's why you're tuned in. So let's not despair. Let's get on with the fight, and let's get on with the show. Thank you all for coming.
Hello, I'm Walter Shapiro, staff writer for the New Republic, and we're going to have a very fast-paced but fascinating discussion. Let me, normally I would say my mother would be so pleased. She wanted me to go to law school, and finally I'm on a panel with such legal talent. But I won't digress because we don't have time. Directly to my right is Michael Pollack, who is a professor at the Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva, and he's also the co-director of the Florsheim Center for Constitutional Democracy. Next to him in the middle is my old colleague from the Brennan Center, Wendy Weiser, who is the vice president for democracy, the greatest expert on voting rights and other issues. And at the end, we have Andrew Weissmann, who is a professor of law at NYU. He was also the lead prosecutor for a fellow by the name of Robert Mueller from 2017 to 2019. And normally I would give a long introduction, but let me go right into it, which is we're now in a situation where the voters in Iowa do not seem to be unhappy with the idea of Donald Trump as a Republican nominee, which brings us to a certain 14th Amendment case that is heading towards the Supreme Court. Do any of you think that is anything other than a slam dunk, that the court will just reject what Maine and Colorado did in terms of barring him from the ballot under the 14th Amendment? Anyone want to weigh in on this?
I think we're in violent agreement that we do not think that the court is going to affirm the Colorado Supreme Court, but I think we might also be in agreement that we don't think that the court, this is Michael's point, the court writ large, in other words, that the majority of the court will weigh in on the issue of that was found by the trial court in Colorado and the Secretary of State in Maine, that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. So I think it'll be left to the voters to essentially be implementing the 14th Amendment at the ballot box, because they can decide they do not want an insurrectionist in the White House.
Do any of you have any idea what excuse the court will use not to say that Trump is barred from the ballot?
Well, I'll start by talking about what excuses I think they will not use. And I think that those are actually more important. As Andrew mentioned, I do not think the court will say that Donald Trump did not engage in insurrection. I think that is critical. And I think it's critical as people talk about the outcome of the case that is clear, that it is not described as a vindication of the claim of insurrection, which is going to be actually tried in the court of the ballot box, but also in other courtrooms and other forms over the course of the year. I also think the court is not going to and should not accept an invitation that they overrule the Colorado Supreme Court's interpretation of Colorado election law. There is a little backdoor attempt to try to relitigate a case that the court threw out last term to invoke this independent state legislature theory and to override state constitutional law and other judicial review checks on state authority in elections, and that would be a bad outcome. I don't think it's going to happen, but that's also really important. And I think that there's about 20 or so other issues that the court could rule on. There are many issues where the case could, side doors where the court could get out of the case.
Let me say one more Trump question, since it hovers over everything, including the crisis of the courts in America, which is, do any of you have a sense of will there be a verdict in any of the criminal trials for Trump before the election? One of the most encouraging things that keeps popping up in polls is even a significant number of Republicans say that in theory they would not vote for Trump if he were convicted of a crime.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a guess, and obviously there are ways that judges can do what Judge Cannon is doing now, which is to pocket veto the trial before the general election. So I don't think that one will go, and I don't think Georgia will go. But I do think, absent the Supreme Court doing something, which I really don't think they will do. I don't think they will have 5 votes for it. I think that the D.C. January 6th case, which in my view is the most significant case, I think that case and I think the Manhattan case are going to go to trial before the general election, and I think both of those will have a verdict before the general election.
Which may be the most important fact to come out of this entire panel.
Well, it's not a fact.
Well, I mean, were it to happen, it would be a fact. Forgive me for arguing with lawyers. It's a futile endeavor. Staying newsy, the Supreme Court today had arguments in what is known as the Chevron case, which is basically a dispute brought on by right-wing groups to overturn the 1984 decision that basically gives large scope to federal regulatory agencies. And if the Chevron entirely was overturned, it would eviscerate much of the regulatory activity of the federal government. Could somebody explain where we are on this and how and what your outlook is on it?
Sure. I mean, in the interest of maybe calming folks a little bit, I think that's a little bit overstating the importance of Chevron,
Okay.
or the consequences of overruling it.
That's why my mother is so disappointed I didn't go to law school.
Chevron basically says that when a statute is ambiguous, federal courts are meant to defer to agency interpretations of that ambiguous text. And so that does, as Walter said, give agencies a lot more latitude to interpret and act based on their interpretation of vague delegations of authority from Congress, as most of them are, pretty capacious, pretty vague. But the reality is that in the last 5 years, even 10 years, most courts have sort of gotten the message from the Supreme Court that this doctrine is at least disfavored, not outright overruled. And the Supreme Court itself has not relied on Chevron for a number of years in deciding any of these cases. And so we're already sort of living in a world without Chevron. And so the court coming out and saying, okay, we're now overruling it, the likelihood that it would really change a whole lot of outcomes, I think, is low. What I do want to point out, though, or frame it as, is yet another aspect of the court's assault, is probably too strong a word, the court's endeavor to shrink the role of administrative agencies, to shrink the footprint of regulation, to make it harder for presidents and agencies to engage in regulation. And that, it's easy to talk about regulation as a sort of anti-business thing, but regulation protects us from health hazards, from unsafe vehicles, unsafe products, unsafe financial products. So it is a significant part of our lives that is at stake in this broader project.
I just wanted to add another perspective about really how astonishing it is. Even if other courts have gotten the message from the Supreme Court, it has sent a message, and it is already dismantling really the way that the law has covered administrative agencies for more than 40 years. This is yet another way in which the court is radically rewriting constitutional law, the relations between the different branches of government, and a whole bunch of other aspects of our democracy. And it's very rapid and very sweeping, and I think this is something that should concern us a lot.
Let me come at another aspect of the Supreme Court and the hierarchy of ethical behavior. Sometimes some of the jurists maybe are not exactly role models for abstemious lifestyles, starting with Clarence Thomas. We have had 782 editorials, 4,693 op-eds deploring this, 812 speeches on the floor of the Congress by Democrats deploring this, and no discernible change. Do any of you think that anything will be done by the court to deal with the level of embarrassment that Thomas and to a lesser extent Alito caused?
No.
So, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. But I think that one thing that we're seeing and that this illustrates is, and I'm going to relate it to Donald Trump, is this idea that might makes right, and that there's no accountability with respect to doing the right thing. That it's shocking enough with somebody who, as the president, would do things like, I'm not going to respond to congressional subpoenas and to oversight authority with no consequence. Obviously, that's just one example. But you're talking to three lawyers, so for us, seeing it in the Supreme Court is really dispiriting, to say the least, because if there's any place where might makes right, it should not exist and is antithetical to what this country is about, it should be at the Supreme Court. And so that kind of behavior being not controlled by the justices themselves in a responsible way or by Congress is, I think, a real sign of the times, which is basically an attitude of what are you going to do about it?
So I agree with what's been said, but I will add that the outcry has had an effect. I do think we don't want to understate actually the way in which the court has responded to it. First, the public opinion of the Supreme Court is at an all-time low. That is in significant part to all of this discussion of corruption and all of those 843 editorials that you're talking about in speeches. But the court itself has been feeling the pressure. We saw that when Justice Alito went to the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal to try to rebut some ethics allegation about it. And we saw it when the court voluntarily did something that it had been saying it wasn't going to do for some time, which is adopting a weak and unenforceable ethics code, but an ethics code and putting it out. And in the introduction to the ethics code, it actually said, there's been some misconception in the public about whether or not we have an ethics code, and we want to clear that up. It was feeling the pressure of all of this, and I think that that has an impact on its behavior, and I think it makes a difference, and I think it, ought to continue.
I also think, I think it's absolutely right. I think the court worries about its own reputation, its own perception. But I also think, setting aside that sort of parochial interest, right, the court is aware, we're all aware, that they don't have anything other than our trust in them or our faith in them, right? They are unelected, they are life tenured. They know, as every government actor knows, and as every person knows too, right, that all that they have is our trust in them, and they're an important part of our democratic system. And that's why it's, I think, particularly dangerous when, as Wendy said, faith in the court is at an all-time low, when that faith is what is so essential to a third of the federal government, and we don't know how to fix it. They don't know how to fix it, right? I guess I should say there are some ways we could think of fix it, but they're not going to do those things, right? And so in the realm of in the zone of things that are plausible, I don't know what those are.
Well, Congress can certainly step in and do a whole lot to fix this, and I'll leave you to ask questions about that.
One of the aspects that has always concerned me is when Thomas was quoted as saying, "I can't live on $400,000 a year." That the whole, and nobody can, it's a tough life out there. But basically, there was a period, and I can exaggerate it a little, probably up through the Reagan era, where people in Washington realized that you had a choice. You can pursue a life of influence and power, or you can pursue a life of money. And you would give up one for the other. Money people did not sit on the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court justices did not fly private planes around the world to every vacation destination you can think of. And one of the sad legacies, and I really actually think it dates back to Reagan, is the blurring of that trade-off. Because there are many things wrong with America, but the idea that you gave up something to have power and influence, I always thought was an admirable thing. Moving back to the court, let's assume Joe Biden, pray God, is reelected, and you have a Democratic Congress, even though probably with very tight margins. Is there anything that can be done to reform the Supreme Court other than waiting for the normal demographics of the 6 conservatives?
So I'll start, and there are a number of proposals that are currently pending in the Congress. There's a lot of ferment and discussion around this. The one that I'll elevate first is term limits with regular appointments for Supreme Court justices. This is wildly popular across all political persuasions. This is how every other democracy treats its highest court. This is how 49 of our 50 states work. It is common sense. Americans understand that no one should have public power for that long. And it is something that has actually, Chief Justice Roberts, before he was on the court, was a proponent of it. Senator Ted Cruz was a proponent of it. This is something that has a long pedigree and support, and it can be done by statute, and that is key. It is something that is consistent with our constitutional system, something that Congress can do by statute. And can go a long way towards restoring faith in the system and to depoliticizing the Supreme Court selection process, especially when coupled with selection reform, which might require some more constitutional change.
Speaking of election reform, we've all been talking totally about the Supreme Court, but so many of the decisions that affect democracy and the 2024 elections will come from lower courts or from state courts. What do you worry about the most, and is there any optimism about how that this will be, in some ways, in terms of voter participation, a better election than 2020 or 2016?
Well, that's a very big question. So there's a lot of things to worry about in this election, and there are a lot of moving pieces, and there are a lot of efforts to suppress votes, subvert election outcomes, and there's a lot of strains on our election system across the board. And since this panel is about the courts, and so I'll just focus on it, the courts are seeing a couple of things that I think are threatening to the election. We're seeing a very big surge of litigation from people that are trying to use the courts to restrict access to voting. That was a new innovation in the 2020 election that the Trump campaign and allies brought to the system, and now we're seeing it fairly routinized as a way of trying to roll back voting access with affirmative litigation. That's going through the courts. Another thing that we're seeing is actually emboldened by the Supreme Court's rollback of voting rights and other democratic rights. We're seeing lower courts issuing increasingly radical decisions rolling back core rights and voting rights in particular. The Voting Rights Act has been the subject of a lot of very loopy and dangerous decisions that are really cutting it back. There is a crazy decision that came out of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals actually saying that private voters and groups representing voters don't have the right to enforce the Voting Rights Act. There's no private right of action, and so the 50 odd years of enforcement of the Voting Rights Act didn't exist. That was all wrong. Only the Department of Justice can do that. That is just one of many of those kinds of things that are going through the lower courts, and I think there's a lot of risk to future further damage to voting rights. I'll just add, the courts are still going to be important in thwarting election sabotage efforts, and we did see in 2022 a lot of courts stepped up when people were trying to deny certification or take other really radical steps to subvert election outcomes. Courts did step up. 2020, 60 odd courts also rejected litigation brought by Trump campaign and allies to try to overturn the results. So the courts are going to definitely be a very fraught playing field heading into this election.
Just a plug for the branch of government that actually has stood up, I think, fairly well, particularly if you look at the level below the Supreme Court. To quote a judge from the DC trial court, the courtroom is still a place where facts and law matter. And particularly because between now and the general election, there is going to be a frontal attack on judges and the judicial process. It's going to be very important for people to sort of realize how well they have done, by and large, with minor exceptions, in adhering to their oaths of office. And I think there'll be tons of litigation. There's huge issues that Wendy has talked about, but I think in terms of, the sort of repetition of claims of that the election was stolen, at the end of the day, there are hearings, evidence is needed, judges are used to looking at the evidence and abiding by that, and these are judges who were appointed by the wide spectrum of presidents, and so I think they've done really well, and I think there's going to be a need for people in the country to understand that and to support the judiciary. I mean, we're seeing it today with respect to Judge Kaplan, who's presiding over the second of the E. Jean Carroll cases, and the former president, directly criticizing him for, doing his job.
And I think it's important, we were talking about the Supreme Court and the loss of public confidence, but I do think Andrew's right. It's important to not lose faith in the courts writ large and to understand that by and large, obviously with exceptions, but by and large, they are doing their jobs and they are demanding evidence and holding claimants to a standard of facts, say nothing of law, but of facts. And so I think as the American public, it's important to have the courts back when the court is trying to have democracies back.
One of the things in the Mitt Romney book came out that he talked about how a lot of Republican senators know better but are afraid of retaliation if they go against Trump. What we have seen with a lot of judges, court officials, is overt retaliation, whether bomb threats, I guess the new word is swatting, where you send a SWAT team to someone's house on a slow Wednesday. And what I'm wondering is, what can be done beyond what law enforcement is doing now? And how much should we worry about a world in which judges and court officials are intimidated by threats of mob violence?
You have a lot of
So I'm going to be really quick, but now obviously the investigation and prosecution is important, and as serious as a problem as it is with respect to judges and prosecutors and journalists. I'm particularly concerned about what is going to happen with respect to witnesses and jurors. Those are people where it could have an effect, and it reminds me of when I was a young prosecutor doing organized crime cases. And there were all sorts of steps we had, including the witness protection program. But the idea that we're thinking about that with respect to the former president of the United States is a sign of the world we're in. One example is to, again, refer back to Judge Kaplan. In a civil defamation case, there is a fully anonymous and partially sequestered jury because of the concern about the safety of the jurors. The jurors go by number, and they were instructed to not use their names even with each other because of and that is an extraordinary step even in a criminal case. But that is the kind of measure that I think you're going to see, whether it's the Manhattan District Attorney's criminal case against Donald Trump or the Jack Smith case before Judge Chutkan. You're going to see those kinds of steps, I think, put in place. For witnesses, it'll be a lot more difficult.
And I wanted to also zoom out a little bit and look at the broader climate of political violence that's being stoked here, and that is impacting judges, and we're seeing all of those threats and attacks and swatting on judges. And just a couple of years ago, the U.S. Marshal Service did a study of just attacks on judges and found it increased, and prosecutors almost fivefold from 2015 to 2021, and I assume that now it's only going up. This is part of a broader climate, and we at the Brennan Center have been tracking this, especially as it relates to election officials, so another group that has been suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of a election denier, movement that is increasingly threatening and harassing them. And they didn't have the protections that judges had. And I do think we found that the protections that judges had need to be bolstered. They are not enough. They're getting through. There was a really grisly murder of a judge's family member just in another, not related to these cases, a couple of years ago, but it's been, but even election officials didn't even have those basic protections against their personally identifiable information, like legal protections against harassment, physical protections for themselves or their offices that judges had. And so we are seeing this really across the board. And we know some of the measures that need to be taken, but with the advent of the internet and with the scale and scope of this movement, it's increasingly difficult to, we need to be investing a lot more resources and effort into this, into the safety of our public servants.
No, it's something I worry about. But while there's been a little hope in terms of talking about how the courts stood up to Trump and election denials, amid this moderately depressing discussion, let me end by just asking, is there anything else that any of you are really worried about that deserves more attention than it's gotten?
Yes, but
All we do is worry. No, I think something Wendy said is worth just focusing on, which is that there is a distinct possibility that the Supreme Court will be viewed as ruling in favor of Trump in the disqualification litigation. And I think it's going to be really important for people to understand that this is an issue that, there are lots of interesting, difficult issues on both sides. It is important for the Supreme Court to resolve it, and that's it. It's not a vindication of one side or the other. It's certainly not going to vindicate sort of what his conduct was.
Not even Bush versus Gore?
no.
Right, exactly. Right. And so I just think that is the downside of the litigation having been brought, is that risk. And it's really important for people to think about the world where we could easily be in. Maybe we won't be, but I think there's a good chance after the court hears us on February 8th that we would be in that position. And it's really important for people to understand the framing of that, because certainly Donald Trump, as is right, will be saying this is a vindication, but I don't think that is the correct way to view it.
I think it's really important for journalists, some of you might be in the room,
I don't know where.
to frame these outcomes appropriately for the American public, right? That, headlines matter. I think, you see this a lot on the platform formerly known as Twitter, where, publications are taken to task for the way that a headline is crafted that might obscure a little bit some of what actually happened, to sort of tamp it down, or, I think Andrew's right, to frame it in a way that obscures too much of the complexity, right? And it just sells it as Trump won the case. I think it's really critical that communication, the court does not do that communication. That's on journalists and it's on us, and I think it's really critical to be extremely clear about what happens, even when it's highly technical, right? But to say, this is what happened, this is what was decided, and this what wasn't decided.
I'll add, we've been talking.
You get the last word, Wendy.
All right, thank you. I'll try to make it a good one. We've been talking both about the courts as safeguards or necessary backstop safeguards and enforcers of the law, but also the Supreme Court as a source of a lot of the challenges and problems that we're facing today, and wanted to underscore that a lot of the democracy protections and voting rights and rule of law protections that existed have been systematically dismantled by this court over the last decade and a half. But I will say, a lot of what's been done can actually be undone and fixed by Congress and by legislation. And I sort of want to end not on the depressing note, but on the, at some point, there will be a Congress, and it could be a point very soon, that can pass these reforms to the Supreme Court, put in place term limits, ethics reforms, whatever other necessary reforms are needed, and then can actually put in place systematic democracy reform, voting rights legislation, stuff that came just this close to passing before. And so we could really turn this all around if we make this the center of our political battle right now.
Listen, thank you, Wendy, for leaving us singing the title tune. You don't want people leaving the theater too depressed. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Michael.
And good evening to everybody who is here. I am based out of Miami, so you guys were really challenging me with this cold. I'm not gonna lie to you. And for those of you that are tuning in remotely, thanks for joining us as well. My name is Katie Phang. I'm the host of the Katie Phang Show on MSNBC. I am also a legal analyst and a legal correspondent for the network. It is my honor to be moderating our next panel, as you can see. Thank gosh for the large font for me getting older. The abortion voting rights connection. So it's tough to follow the panel that we just did, but it's amazing how absolutely relevant the dialogue and conversation that we just listened to with the first panel is to what we're going to be talking about right now. But I'm gonna actually introduce the panelists right now. I would urge all of you to take the time at your leisure to please go check them out, their bios, their backgrounds, because it's a pretty spectacular group of women that we have right now. To my immediate right is Deirdre Schifeling. And again, just an amazing group of people here. In the middle is Lourdes Rosado. Muchas gracias. Yo hablo español. And then at the far end, we have Gretchen Borchelt. And you can see what their titles are based on the screen behind us. But let's just get into the panel now. So Deirdre, I really would love to start with you. The first question that I want to pose to you is the following, which is, despite the best efforts, many states have a very long history of voter suppression. And I find that the voter suppression usually starts percolating around some key hot button issues and topics, including abortion and reproductive rights access. So what impact is the voter suppression kind of movement having right now on reproductive rights? And more importantly, kind of as an overview generally for the people tuning in and watching, Like, where are we right now when it comes to that? What's the kind of landscape that we're looking at right now?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that question. I think the key ingredient here is really power. And we have to understand both the attacks on voting and the attacks on democracy, as well as the attacks on reproductive rights and all kinds of rights, as being fundamentally about power. And when you look at what the landscape is across the country in terms of reproductive access, reproductive freedom, the states that have either entirely banned abortion or have severely restricted abortion, 26 states across this country since the Dobbs decision, those states track very closely with states that have restricted voting, restricted democracy, that have heavily gerrymandered state legislatures, that have other ways of really invalidating voters' voices in those states. And I think this is really dangerous. It's really dangerous for all the reasons that the panel right before us just said about the lean towards might makes right, that kind of creeping authoritarianism. Jamel Bowie, the New York Times columnist, had this amazing phrase in a column about a month ago that's really stuck with me as he describes these attacks on democracy and really undermining the will of the voters. And the rolling back of reproductive rights is a great example of undermining the will of the voters. And that phrase is the cultivation of political despair. The cultivation of political despair. And I think that's really true, and it really resonates for me, because it's a way of, at every turn, no matter what voters say, despite the fact that 2/3 of voters in our country support reproductive rights, support access to abortion, at every turn, the majorities of, largely Republican legislatures in state after state, in the Supreme Court, right now in our House of Representatives, move to invalidate what those voters want and throw up obstacles for those voters to make their voice heard. And that really leads folks to the logical conclusion that nothing they do matters. And I think that is the cultivation of political despair that we have to fight against tooth and nail.
So, Lourdes, we were speaking before the panel started about how sometimes it's not that we have a want of empathy, but sometimes if we speak frankly, sometimes we have to have an impact for us to want to experience and to have the change. Sometimes we have the luxury and the privilege of being able to sit where we are and not be directly impacted. I really wanted to kind of drill down and have you give an example, a case study in real life of somebody who has been directly impacted by the draconian attacks and the abortion bans that we've been seeing, so that maybe just in a minute that people could maybe sense exactly how much of an impact there has been on individuals, because it's not just voters amorphously. These are real people that are being directly impacted by these laws.
Yes, thanks so much, Katie, and thank you. I love the what you were saying earlier, Deirdre, about it. It's about power and those in power not wanting to give it up. I mean, we've been working. Our advocacy is really focusing on showing how women of color are going to be disproportionately impacted by these abortion bans. That, in fact, it's not only impacting their reproductive health, which in and of itself is vital, but also their economic stability and their economic mobility. I mean, right now, like more than 60% of those who are seeking abortion in this country are women of color, and about half of them live below the poverty line. And just looking at Latinas, for example, there are about 58% of Latinas in the United States are of childbearing age, and that compares with only 38% of white women, who it's almost a 20-point differential, and it will also only grow in the future as the Latino population has continued to grow. And so many of them live in those 26 states, right? There's something like 43% of all Latinas in childbearing years live in those 26 states. So they are they are being directly affected. So we've been approaching this at LatinoJustice as an issue not only of reproductive rights, but of economic justice for our population. And recently we got involved in the challenge to the Florida 15-week abortion ban, HB 5, and wrote an amicus brief along with some other groups who really serve this population, and featured the story of a woman who we'll call Alma, who's a Latina Floridian who was directly impacted by the ban. She was unable to obtain abortion care because of it and was forced to travel out of state at a substantial personal cost and financial cost to get this abortion, even though her fetus had a life-threatening health condition and she had a previous medical condition, underlying condition, that really risked her own health if she continued the pregnancy. But the doctor's office would not assist her with the abortion for fear of this law, of being prosecuted under this law. And Alma was is a working class family. She's a working class family who has limited income, and this really had a devastating impact on her.
And Gretchen, one of the things we just heard from Lourdes is that her organization filed an amicus brief, or an amicus brief, right? And I wanted to have the next kind of conversation with you for this panel about the role of the judiciary. We heard in the previous panel exactly, an activist jurist or judiciary and what they can singularly accomplish when they're hell-bent on doing it. But when we talk about voting rights and we talk about access to voting, inevitably it brings up conversations about redistricting and gerrymandering and the ability to cheat what the electorate wants. But in the context of voting rights, we've seen what happens with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, with the Dobbs decision. We now know that the Supreme Court has taken up one of two appeals for mifepristone, the abortion pill. I mean, it is a never-ending, never-ceasing attack on reproductive rights. I wanted to ask you about how we're supposed to watch the judiciary be so actively involved on such a personal and intimate part of our lives.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having us. Thanks for hosting this panel. It's dire. It's dire in the courts for reproductive rights. I don't think we can sugarcoat it. The federal courts have been, because of restrictions on voting rights, we have people in the Senate who are voting for judges who have extreme anti-abortion records and were cherry-picked for that particular reason, got confirmed, and are now in these courts across the country, in federal courts across the country. And you mentioned the mifepristone case. So this is a case that is going before the Supreme Court that will decide whether people will continue to have access to medication abortion, one of the two pills that's used most commonly for medication abortion, which is over half of abortions in this country. And in that case, the organization that brought this case was created in order to challenge the case. It was a made-up organization. They picked a district that they would be in Texas for this particular judge. Judge Kaczmarek in Amarillo, Texas, is the sole federal judge there. And so they incorporated this organization so they could get to this judge, who then decided to eliminate access to this safe and effective method of medication abortion that's been used for over 20 years. That decision was stayed, so it's still status quo right now for medication abortion, but it's now going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to hear this case this term. The Supreme Court's also going to hear a case about access to emergency care for people who need abortion in emergency situations. And this is another case that shouldn't be before the Supreme Court, because in that case, it was in Idaho, and the Biden administration said, we have a federal law called EMTALA that guarantees access to emergency care for people who need it. And that overrides your Idaho state ban, which has no exceptions. And Idaho said, no, we're going to defend that with the help of a very conservative anti-abortion organization. They're defending that law. The district court stayed that law, and the Supreme Court decided to come in and let the law go into effect and is hearing that case, even though it hasn't been heard by the next level court. So the Supreme Court, which I should add, said in Dobbs, part of the reason we're overturning this Roe v. Wade decision is because it's led to all this litigation. For all of these years, we've had all this litigation, and this is going to put an end to it. It's just going to be decided by states. Well, now we have two cases going before the Supreme Court, just barely, not even 2 years after that decision. So the judiciary has a goal, It has a goal, along with anti-abortion activists, which is to end the use of abortion in this country. And I think we're seeing that play out in these court cases. I also think we're seeing it play out with the ballot initiatives across the country. Because now that people are starting to vote in favor of abortion access, when it's put to voters, not when it's put to state legislators who gerrymandered the elections and the voting so that they would stay in power, when it's put to the voters and they decide to protect abortion access, what we're seeing now is anti-abortion activists change the rules, attack democracy, change the ballot initiative process, do whatever they can to stop it so that they can overturn the will of the voters and stay in power. Back to Deirdre's point.
And Deirdre, that's my next question to you. Why is the electorate getting it so wrong, though? Because if the numbers objectively justify the decisions to be done, which is to allow people to have the individual decisions, the independence to be able to decide for themselves that they want to have access to reproductive rights, what's wrong? What's the disconnect between what the electorate is doing versus what the public wants them to do?
Yes, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head here, which is that the elected officials are not acting in the interests of their voters, of their citizens. And I think we saw, in ballot initiative, every single ballot initiative in this country, all 7 that have been run since Dobbs, have won, no matter what state, Kansas, Ohio, Michigan, you name it, the voters have voted in many cases overwhelmingly to protect reproductive freedom. And the ACLU has been a big part of most of those campaigns. What's interesting is that part of, I think, what is happening here is because of the gerrymandering, because of the lack of accountability of elected officials to their voters. Like if the only election that an elected official needs to worry about is their primary, right? Because their district is so gerrymandered, there's no hope of the other party winning it. They only have to worry about their primary. It really distorts their incentives in terms of governing. And it creates sort of a race to the fringe, or the race to the right in this case, of the most extreme position, so that they are in the best possible position to galvanize their very, very small base of primary voters who they need to win their next election. So in some sense, it's quite rational what state legislatures are doing. They are responding to the incentives that an extreme gerrymander has presented them with, which is to pander to the most right wing of their primary voters and sort of outdo themselves in their opposition to reproductive rights and other rights and liberties. So I think the solution to this is to restore fair districts, restore voting rights, kind of go back to a system of government where we can actually hold those elected officials accountable when they have positions that are out of step with what the majority of voters in their state want.
Go ahead, Gretchen.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Deirdre was saying. I think one of the hopeful things about this ballot initiative effort is not only that they've succeeded in all 7 states where they've been brought, but also the turnout, right? The turnout and the energy and the excitement, especially among young voters who are turning out for the issue of abortion. They are listing that as the reason they're out there voting. And we're seeing especially young people of color and young women are voting for these issues. And I think it's also demonstrated what we have known for a long time, but politicians have not believed, which is that not only that abortion is a winning issue, but it's actually a nonpartisan issue. That it's, as an issue, it is attracting Republicans, that it's attracting independents. People are voting for this issue. We wouldn't have had the success in the states where we've had it, like Kansas, like Kentucky, without that being true. So that is something that is bringing me hope in these dire times, and something that I think politicians are starting to wake up to.
But I do want to ask you about Ohio, for example, though, because it took a 2-step process to get there, though. It took the vote to be able to make sure that it made it to the ballot in the first place. Then it successfully passes in Ohio with a resounding number of people coming out to vote. But then the state legislature says, you know what, we're not even going to abide by it. We're going to try to pass another statute that says we don't even have to listen to what the law is. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in Florida, for example, where you got enough petition signatures to be able to get the ballot initiative on the ballot. And yet now we're waiting for the Florida Supreme Court to decide through its Republican Attorney General whether or not the language is appropriate to even be on the ballot. I mean, it's not as easy as just getting people to say, this is what we want, and we're just going to get it there.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm sorry. That was a question.
And just to build on that, there have been 150 pieces of legislation introduced in state legislatures across the country just in the past 2 years to try to restrict this ballot initiative process. So only half the states in the country even have direct democracy ballot initiatives as an option. But that's right. This has been a new site of contestation in terms of the rights attempt to kind of circumvent voters and change the rules, raise the threshold, do everything they can to kind of throw up barriers to voters making their voice heard in that process. So in Ohio, that's right. We were very successful in turning out voters, even in the dead of August, to defeat this attempt to raise the threshold to 60%. But it's never ending. After we defeated that, and with lots of other partners, the next thing that the legislature decided to do was voter purges in advance of November, and it never ends.
Right.
So
I totally agree. I mean, I too was buoyed, right, by the turnout, but I think we're all in agreement that voter suppression is alive and well, and it's also targeted at groups that are not in power, right? Because I work on behalf of the Latino community, and I do a lot of meeting with community activists, and I always say, who are facing voter purges and talking about, I was just thinking today about the 2020 midterms and this horrible photo that I saw of two armed men in mass standing side by, on one side or the other of a ballot box out in Arizona. Again, a state with a high Latino population, and just thinking about the everyday voter suppression that is happening. And I tell my colleagues, my community members, hey, they're doing this because they're scared of your growing power, right? They know that you are 19% of the population now. Latinos are 1 in 4 youth under 18, so it's only going to grow. And they're trying to protect their power and privilege, and it really goes directly to your ability to for economic mobility and education.
Lourdes, you've got more than 25 years of deep involvement in the social justice landscape. What lessons haven't been learned? The fact that we're having this conversation again, what lessons haven't been learned from what you've seen? Because you may have a focus in the Latino space, but it's applicable to all communities, and especially those of color.
Yeah, I think what is just surprising to me, we just celebrated my organization's 50th anniversary last year, and we had this wonderful opportunity. We did an oral history film. We had our 3 co-founders talk about in a documentary how they started the organization in its first years. And my God, the issues that they were facing 50 years ago, we're still facing now. Language access, for example. This is a huge issue, not only for the Latino population, but for many Asian communities in terms of being able to access the ballot. And we do a lot of work around language access. It's like whack-a-mole. I mean, there is more boards of elections around the country that are in breach of the federal requirements around language access that are really complying with it. And that was true to 50 years ago as well. And so it's sort of disheartening. But on the other hand, it also makes me emphasize to people that it really is about the fundamentals, that we really have to focus on sheer voter access. Are people actually being able to get to the polls physically? Are there issues around disability access, about language access? Is there voter intimidation? Is there misinformation? Oh my goodness, that is, I'm just really worried about that going into this election, how much misinformation is being generated.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that, I mean, I think lessons that we are learning when it comes to abortion rights are very similar, that we had the right for a long time, but we didn't necessarily have access for everyone. And so as we think about what is the future of abortion in this country, we have to learn those lessons, that a right is meaningless if the access is not there, if it's not truly meaningful for people to be able to access it. And unfortunately, some of the same communities that Lourdes is talking about did not have true access. And that's partly because Roe was chipped away at for so long by these anti-abortion state legislators, by judges who allowed certain kind of challenges to go forward and chip it away. But that's a real lesson for us too as a movement, is how do we guarantee not just the right in the future, but access for everybody who needs it in a meaningful way, without stigma, without barriers, without judgment.
Deirdre, are we being naive in thinking that we're oversimplifying it by saying, oh, well, if abortion's on the ballot, then that will guarantee a turnout, when there's all of these intricacies that are involved when it comes to something as simple as access?
Well, I think if you are thinking about abortion politically, abortion is a hugely winning issue. And I will say that that was not always the case. It was not such a salient electoral issue. It was not driving what vote choice for voters prior to Dobbs. So when we had the right, people felt secure in the right, they didn't really vote on it. It was like, 5 or 6 on the list. Now it's number 1 on the list for many, many voters. And we have a 20-point advantage on it in terms of generating voter turnout. Young people, voters of color, actually voters of all kinds are animated by abortion, voting for abortion access. It's not going to be enough to do that, though. We need to elect candidates who support abortion access, and then we need to fight like hell to pass a federal bill that would restore abortion access across the country. We cannot do this whack-a-mole, state-by-state campaign because of the gerrymandering, because of the voter suppression. This is a human right. It's a fundamental human right. We need to restore it at the federal level.
Lourdes, when there are so many issues, though, especially for certain communities, just for example, for the Latino community, just even dealing with the immigration issues, for example, right, which are inescapable. And it's not just the Latinos, it's pretty much everyone that's trying to come to this country, right? But we'll focus on that. Is abortion enough of an important issue, though?
I think it is in the Latino community. It's so interesting because I think there's a trope out there that Latinos are Catholic, they're conservative. I was talking with the head of a Latino voter engagement organization who had recently done some field polling and field work, focus groups, and really, actually, a lot of Latinos have a strong sense of family privacy. What she was telling me, that people like, that's their, that's that person's issue. We don't get, we're not gonna so I think their sense of privacy is very strong. So I think it's important, but it's also, I think, when I talk with folks, the number one issue besides immigration in a lot of families, it's a big issue, is economic mobility. And when for so many Latina-headed households, for example, earn pennies on the dollar compared to a white male-headed household, have pennies to the dollar in net worth of a white male compared to a white male household. For so many Latinas, it's an economic issue. It's like, when are they going to be able to get an education and pursue a career, pursue a job that will do more for their family. So I think when a lot of Latinos look at it that way, which explains why I believe there is strong support within the Latinx community for abortion rights.
And, Gretchen, objectively speaking, and putting aside, any type of personal opinion I have about Matthew Kaczmarek, for example, when judges are sitting on the bench, ostensibly, they are applying the law that is created by statute, which is done by legislators, right? Is it necessarily the case then that the judiciary is the boogeyman here? And is it wrong to be focusing on that if they are technically applying the laws that are on the books?
Well, these judges are not applying the law in good faith in any way, shape, or form. And they're recognizing harms that don't exist and not recognizing harms that, for example, pregnant people have, right? So they're trying to get to an outcome. Their decisions are outcome determined. But I should also say there are some good judges and good courts, and especially in state courts. You know, there are some really good existing state constitutional provisions that we and ACLU and others are trying to use to ground access to abortion care in other ways. So for example, we have a lawsuit in Missouri using the state establishment clause, and we brought it on behalf of a number of faith leaders who say that the state abortion ban violates their own beliefs, their own religious beliefs, that their religious beliefs foster and accept people's decisions to make for themselves about whether or not to have an abortion. And these legislators who are legislating their religious beliefs into law and banning abortion are violating the separation of church and state. And so that's an example. There are many others. We're trying to use provisions around the right to equality and equal protection for people, right? Because some of the reasons that Lourdes talked about, that it is an equality right, that you have access to abortion care so that you can succeed in your career, you can provide for your family. It's an economic issue, right? So there are many ways that we are trying to bring other challenges and other theories, legal theories that will ground the right to reproductive health care in new laws. And there are some judges that are open to it. There are some extreme ones who are not, but there are some who are open to it and are thinking really thoughtfully about the law and how it can work in this circumstance.
And so, Deirdre, should that be the new framing then? Should the framing of the issue of abortion vis-a-vis voting not be, quote unquote, just the abortion itself, right? Should it be the economic mobility? Should it be the equality conversation? Should it be the nobody's talking about what happens if you have to have the child and the economic pressures it creates because we don't have affordable childcare, right? I mean, is that the way that the framing should be done? That it kind of goes beyond just that initial kind of conversation about abortion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reproductive rights and making your own decisions about your own body is quite core to equality, period. And that we cannot have equality in our country when we have a group of people that cannot make their own decisions about their own bodies, period. And so I think the point I would make is that actually voting democracy, protecting voting, protecting democracy goes hand in glove with protecting rights. Reproductive rights, LGBT, right, whatever rights, they go hand in glove. And we cannot durably protect rights and liberties in our country without a representative democracy to do it. And so I see those fights as totally linked, totally connected, as key to getting past this point, is linking those two fights.
And Lourdes, do you think that there's being enough done to kind of lift each other up when it comes to the different states and the different jurisdictions, the different communities, to make sure that these conversations are being had and that the education is being had so people understand exactly what is at stake?
I think there's a lot going on. A lot of my peer groups are doing amazing work, but there's more to be done. I think what we really have to do is still remain incredibly vigilant around voter suppression tactics, as well as redistricting issues around gerrymandering. I mean, we're sitting in New York State. Our congressional district maps are being redrawn as we speak. Very much a live issue, and then we're going to have to really be. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole, but we do have to keep meeting every voter suppression or gerrymandered district with litigation and organizing to oppose it.
Gretchen, do you think that, do you want to add anything to what Lourdes just said about this idea that there needs to be maybe a bigger, thicker thread that's kind of connecting organizations and communities to make sure that the messaging is on point and that people truly understand what's at stake when they go to the ballot?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have to battle a lot of misinformation and disinformation that has been really purposefully pointed around abortion. And people being unsure and scared. And of course, now that abortion is illegal in some states, you have fear of criminalization and surveillance and being prosecuted. And so that is a real fear for people day to day, not knowing if it's legal or not in their state, not knowing where they can turn, having questions that they can't get the right answers to. And there has been a campaign of misinformation by anti-abortion activists to keep people confused and scared and unable to assert their rights when they have them. One thing I will just let people know is there is a resource. We and ACLU and some other reproductive rights organizations joined together and launched something called the Abortion Defense Network. So if anybody needs legal advice or representation or financial assistance, we are there for them, and we provide that to them free of charge. So just want to make sure people know that resource is out there, because we are trying in so many ways to work together to respond to this crisis that we have been put in by the Supreme Court.
And that is an appropriate way to end this evening's panel. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, let's start. Thank you everyone who's still with us online, everyone who came out tonight. My name is Melissa Jura-Grant. I'm a staff writer at the New Republic. I am so happy that we're gonna have this conversation. Let me rewrite that. I wish we did not have to have this conversation, which is something I often feel in everything that I write, but here we are. I can't think of anything more critical as we're heading into this very difficult year than affirming our rights to free expression. So I'm going to very briefly introduce each of our panelists, and then we're just going to dive right in. Right next to me, I have Emerson Sykes, Senior Staff Attorney, ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America, and Peter Osnes, founder of Public Affairs Books. So even just thinking about how to start having this conversation, because there's so many different kinds of threats to free expression, so many censorship campaigns, so many people pushing book bans, even though they're deeply unpopular. I was wondering if each of you in turn could shine a light on an example that you're particularly concerned about. It's such a diverse and broad set of problems that we're talking about, and I feel like this is the only way to really lay that out in the beginning.
You want me to start? For me, it's not a single example. It's sort of the spiraling vicious circle that we are in, which involves a kind of soft but serious censoriousness emanating from the left, where there's a kind of pall of orthodoxy that has set in on certain college campuses, where people feel they can't express controversial views or even discuss, say, topics like abortion or immigration or affirmative action for fear of being labeled as a bigot or racist or stigmatized, having those comments follow them through their careers, not being able to shake a statement you might make early in life. And so there's this chilling effect that we do see on college campuses and in the classroom. We've heard from professors who say people won't even engage in a discussion. They have to assign roles and say, you play Scalia, you play Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because nobody will actually raise their hand and give a genuine opinion. So there's that. But in response to that, over the last few years, we have seen an astonishing wave of out-and-out government-sponsored censorship. And it goes far beyond, trying to push back to a place of free speech. It is silencing, they're book bans, they're what we call at PEN America, what we've labeled educational gag orders, which are prohibitions dictating from the legislature what can and can't be taught in a college or high school classroom. There are educational intimidation bills. That's something that says requires that a teacher, say, just put up all their lesson plans and readings on a website so anyone can see, not just the parents, but any citizen in the community. Sounds innocent. It's transparency, right? Except, what are they doing? They're also empowering individual citizens to challenge any reading that may upset or offend them. So it's a direct effort to circumscribe what the teachers are going to assign, what they're going to talk about in the classroom for fear of being disciplined or even losing their jobs. And there's more to it. There are new things all the time. Attacks on tenure, a real strike right now at the heart of the role and independence of the university. And we see this at Harvard with the very unfortunate, kind of sad situation and complex that has unfolded. But there are people who are using that opening to try to fundamentally remake the place of higher education in our society, discredit it, funnel money that goes toward public schools, toward private education. And so that spiral really has to be broken. And at the moment, it's only kind of escalating and intensifying.
Do you guys want to jump in briefly?
Yeah. Well, let me say that the eloquence of all the previous people that you've heard from, they're all really strong and very persuasive advocates. I come at it slightly differently. I'm a journalist, I'm a book publisher. I started reading The New Republic before most of you were born, 1965, 66. And while we're here to wring our hands a bit, let's face it, New Republic's been around a long time. It's been doing amazing work for all those years, and we're here tonight because the New Republic wants us to be talking to you about the issues of the day. So I would like to start by saying thank you to Wynn and the two Michaels and so on for the New Republic generally. My basic view on the Bill of Rights and the Ten Commandments has become that they are subject to interpretation. That one of the lessons that we have learned in recent years is that people take positions sort of based on where they find themselves in life and circumstances. And the problem is trying to be absolutist on any of them, because given the way the democracy works, that's very hard. So we always are going to be in some measure of controversy over each of the individual rights. I give you adultery in the Ten Commandments. I give you the Second Amendment. So what we need to be, perhaps in a way that I think is particularly important, and again, right now when we're in the sort of state of affairs that we are, let's try and look at things in less of a very kind of narrow perspective, try to understand what it is about the Bill of Rights, what it is, less so about the Ten Commandments, but what it is about the Bill of Rights that is at risk, and how we best can go about supporting the things that for whatever reasons we want to support, and trying to deal with the people who don't agree with us.
I guess this is what I get for going last, right? So all the good stuff was taken, but what I think, just to add on, I mean, there were lots of lawyers on the previous panels, but I think I'm the only litigator on this panel, so I'll go straight and directly answer your question. The thing that I am most worried about at the moment, this very instant, in addition to all the things that have been mentioned, are the efforts through speech to erase certain folks from polite political life. And so at the pointy end of the spear at the moment is the LGBTQ community, and particularly drag performances. But the LGBTQ community is implicated in the book bans, the educational gag orders, all of the things that have been mentioned already. But there's a very specific effort underway that we and others have been pushing back against, targeting drag performances. And it seems like a petty thing, it seems like a small thing, it's trivial, it's people dressing up and having fun and dancing and singing. But what it is an effort to decide what kinds of art is allowed, but not just what kinds of art, but what kinds of expression, what kinds of gender expression, and what kinds of being. Some of these laws sweep so broadly that they don't just ban performance in drag, but they ban any sort of gender expression that doesn't accord with someone's gender assigned at birth. So there's so much going on. There's so many ways of approaching the issue, but I wanted to flag that one as it's at the top of my desk at the moment.
Literally probably at the top of your desk at the ACLU. You know, it's a free speech panel. I think you both bring up some points in tension with one another, just to mention that before we keep going. You know, this is an issue, the organizations who are pushing the drag bans, they're some of the same people we were talking about earlier when it comes to abortion bans. They're some of the same people who are pushing litigation in the Supreme Court that could be incredibly damaging to our democracy. That group is called Alliance Defending Freedom. I think it's really helpful to like name the people who have the power in these situations and think about what they are doing with that when they are trying to control people's gender expression, which, you know, sometimes for some people they might not think that's part of speech and free expression. So just to drop that in. I feel like for a lot of folks when they come to this current moment specifically, it's like the last 2 or 3 years on questions around censorship and free speech, the idea that we're even having to deal with book banning feels a little preposterous. We know they're very unpopular. Penn has done great research on that, so has ALA. It seems to be a very small group of people who are pushing them. They also seem to be an opportunity for democracy, where communities who are dealing with these book bans are organizing to push back against them. And so I'm really curious, like, for when we're talking about book bans specifically, it seems like this is a much bigger issue than just books. And I'm wondering if each of you could speak to that. Is there something hidden in there that's getting obscured when we're sort of having these like arguments title by title or even theme by theme? As important as it is whose books are being banned, what are we missing kind of more broadly? That this is a site of attack.
Since books, pretty much what I do.
Please go ahead.
When it comes to book banning, look, there's absolutely no question, none, that every book being banned is being banned for prejudice. I mean, I don't think anybody would challenge that at all. Book bans are not new. Problems in publishing are not new. I mean, I always say that the first book in print was Gutenberg's Bible, and the second one is Publishing is Dead. I mean, we live in a world in which publishing, for all kinds of reasons, and books, because of what they are, always need to be on the defense. What I think we need to understand is I know enough about these little places, these little towns, where the book banning are happening, to know that one way to deal with it is when they ban a book, you mobilize and get that book into people's hands. You can do that. If you want to give $1.25, you can probably get somebody to give you the book, and you can give it to somebody. In other words, don't take the fact that the book is banned in a library to say that it's over, it's gone. No, there are all kinds of ways in which we can get the books. Won't be all that expensive, I promise you. Most publishers will give you the books at, for the price of the printing. And so rather than just throw up our hands in a state of concern or anguish over the fact that book banning exists, always has, but let's make those books available. I'm very much an advocate of finding ways to get people to read books and buy books. The country is reading books. Every year for the last, even in COVID, the percentage of revenue generated by book sales has gone up. Okay, some of it's Britney Spears. But a great deal of it are the books that people want to ban, because sometimes the inverse or the obverse of book banning is to make it a bestseller. That's what happened with Mouse. After years of not being a bestseller, it suddenly became one because people tried to ban it. So think when you can of the positive side of fighting back.
Either of you want to jump in?
Sure. Look, I think, when you ask sort of where does this originate from, I think it's a couple of different threads. I think one piece is the kind of breach of trust and sense of alienation that set in between parents and schools during the pandemic, and the frustrations over learning loss and a kind of pitched anger that arose in certain communities. There's that piece. A second piece, which Emerson alluded to, is, whether you call it fear, prejudice, or a combination thereof, it's a sense among some people that things are moving too quickly, lifestyles and communities are changing, things people grew up with, that they're accustomed to, that they believe are right, are being challenged or cast out, and that this is happening sort of out of their control, and a sort of desire to kind of grasp back and hold back the tide of change, the tide of a pluralistic society in which there's no one single racial group or gender, or that gender is not a binary, that people are living in different ways. And then what's happened on top of that is just an out-and-out weaponization and a concerted movement. These book bans, this is not about people picking up a backpack at home and saying, this book isn't right for my third grader. It's too explicit. It's, dealing with issues of sexuality that are appropriate. That's not what's happening. This is about lists of books that are being passed around from activist to activist in school districts across the country. We see this, they are copying, cutting and pasting the objections to the books they have not read. You can see right down to the typos that it's the same exact complaint about the book, that it's too mature, or it's got sex in it. And that has become a way of waging a culture war, a tactic of political mobilization in some communities, a way to give people a sense that they're kind of pushing back against these trends and tides that they believe are accelerating out of their control. I do want to mention, I don't think these power dynamics are entirely binary. We did a report this year, just last year, called Booklash, that was about a different but related phenomenon that really goes to some of the same issues, which is a phenomenon in the publishing industry where books are being pulled from circulation or withdrawn from publication over objections as to, it could be the conduct of the writer. They've done something that sort of puts them out of bounds. They've been canceled. The idea that the person doesn't have the authority or the right to convey a story that it doesn't reflect their own personal identity, that they're kind of committing a cultural trespass by, a white person writing a story about a black community, or a person who's not from Kosovo, in one case, talking about the war that happened there. And it really goes back to the fundamental principle of the freedom to read, that you don't want an online mob on Goodreads inundating people with one-star reviews, to the point where we have some authors who pulled back the books themselves for fear of what they would endure if they went forward with publication. There's an example of a book about sort of revolutionary Russia, and when Ukrainians went after that author and said, "What are you doing talking about this period?" She was intimidated and she pulled back the book. It hasn't been released, and so. That is another form. It's not government censorship, but it is a soft censoriousness, and it does go to kind of these fundamental ideas of the freedom to read and to explore that we need to uphold. And it's in a sense the same fight as we are waging against book banning.
I agree with all that. I think the only thing I would add is another way that I tend to think about it is that it's a struggle over our national narrative. So there's a way in which these are easy political points that people can score. It's sort of red meat for the voting base of whichever side. But I think it makes sense that school classrooms, in particularly higher institutions of higher education, which are have been seen as liberal bastions, public schools where the next generation is taught about who we are as a country, what things we value, what stories we tell. And in addition, in public libraries, what sorts of literature we lift up, what sorts of stories we pass on to our youth. And I think, where this one is about speech, and the most obvious example of this may be around crackdowns on the media, or sort of at least antipathy towards the media. And so I think the unifying theme and the unifying impulse behind this is an understandable one. As much as I spend all day pushing back against it, and in many ways it's maddening, I think it's about who we are as a people, and we've had decades of progress, right? I grew up with a very whitewashed history presented in schools. I'm sure most people here did. And over the last generation or so, we've had dramatic improvement in the amount of representation of different kinds of stories, a more nuanced picture of how we got to be where we are, and a more honest picture the good, the bad, and the ugly of our history and of our current society. And as Suzanne said, what we're seeing now is an effort to sort of scrub back out some of these things, to pull back. It's a backlash against this progress. So, and just to your point, Peter, these efforts to get around book bans are ongoing. We are litigating right now in Oklahoma against HB 1775, which prohibited a whole list of concepts from K-12 schools. And there was a librarian in a school who was Summer Boismer, who passed out a QR code for the Brooklyn Public Library to try to get around these book bans, and she lost her job. Thankfully, she now lives in New York. We're happy to have her. But she
Works
should
at the Brooklyn Public Library.
right. But she should be back in Oklahoma teaching her students, but she's not being allowed to do so.
I want to try to come at this just slightly differently.
You have 60 seconds.
Sorry?
You have 60 seconds. So we can make
In that
sure we can
case,
get
to
back
hell
to
with
the
it.
other
It's
things.
10 minutes. There's still 10 minutes to go. But no,
I know,
seriously,
but go
because
ahead.
what we're hearing is all very, as I say, it's persuasive, but it shows a certain lack of kind of context, to use a terrible word, which now got people into trouble. The fact is, the business is about what books are published. When Simon & Schuster announced that they were going to publish Mike Pence's book, it was met with outrage, even at Simon & Schuster. 2,000 people signed a petition. How dare you publish Mike Pence? My view of it is, Mike Pence was the Vice President of the United States. He has a story. If he wants to publish a book, I'd publish the book if it meets the standards of the other books I publish. And one thing I would not do is give him a penny more than the book earns. Why would you want to give? Let me finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
Why would you want to give Mike Pence $2 million as a guarantee? That's, as a publisher, and I speak here, in that sense, some credibility. I would publish Mike Pence if he would write a book that I could publish, and I would insist on it, and I would give him only what the book earned. And I think what we have to recognize is that books are ultimately a commodity in the marketplace. And we need to understand how the marketplace works. So let's not make a completely artificial, I will not publish somebody with whom I disagree. I would publish somebody with whom I disagree if they published a book that I would publish, and I wouldn't give them a penny more than they earned.
We could get into a whole publishing thing, but I wish we could, honestly, because I feel like you're the person I'd want to talk about it. But in the interest of making the most of the time that we have left, we've actually kind of hit on this question around, there's different tactics people take when they defend free expression. And I think one tactic is to say, look, like, it's just a book. It's like not going to make somebody queer, or it's like not going to do racial reparations by being published. It's not that important, so like don't get that upset about it. You guys are overreacting. And I think people who are organizing against book bans sometimes get told they're overreacting. This is just a culture war. It's a distraction. But what that crystallizes for me is we have to be defending something more than the book when we're doing this. And you alluded to this in the beginning, that what this often comes down to is a defense of the people for whom the book is a proxy to exclude them from public life and our politics. So I'm wondering if, just to wrap things up, if each of you could take a second and talk about sort of what is really being defended when we're defending a banned book.
Can I
Go
take
ahead.
this one first?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a great question. The idea that we have this idea of free speech where we want to defend speech for its own sake, which we might call sort of an intrinsic value of free speech, but then there's the instrumental value of free speech, and I think we can hold both at the same time, right? Free speech is important because it's how we bring about social change. It's how we let people who are marginalized have a voice and at least make their case for why things should change, right? So there's an instrumentalist way that you can't have social justice without some degree of free speech, I would argue. And I believe deeply in the project of social justice. And free speech has its own value. I come from an international human rights background. If you start from a place of individual human equality, and we all have rights by virtue of being human, including the right to our own ideas and our own expression, then we can, if that's our starting point, then we can get into how it affects other people. But I think it's important not just to hold on to the instrumentalist value, right? Because that's very important. It's how we get change done. But there is an inherent intrinsic value to free speech as well that is born primarily, or at least in the context of the First Amendment, which limits government action. It's not the only thing about free speech. We've been talking about non-government censorship a lot. But when it comes to the First Amendment, what we're primarily worried about is restricting government's authority to regulate private ideas. So in that way, it is especially important when you're limiting power to not only care about free speech when it's people you agree with, because it's the authority of the government that can be wielded against you or against anyone at any time.
Look, I think that's right. A couple of other dimensions that are salient to our work at PEN America. You know, we work with authors, and so watching how authors endure this, and you're right, some Art Spiegelman, Mouse becomes a bestseller when it gets banned, but overwhelmingly these books are by, many of them are by new authors, they're by authors of color, LGBTQ authors. They're not famous, they're not having a surge in sales. These people make their living going into schools with appearances and bookstores and events. That dries up when they become controversial and untouchable. People question whether they can be included in a book fair, and it's devastating to somebody who's built their life on self-expression and telling stories to be curtailed in that way. And then there's the side, of course, of the reader. And you know, some of the books at stake here, honestly, are explicit. I mean, you would look at them and you would say, wow, like this is intense. I don't know how I feel about even my own kid necessarily reading this, or what would be the right age. But what we hear time and again from librarians and teachers is that for certain kids, these books are life-saving. Finding a narrative, if you're living in a rural community and your parents are not going to accept your identity and there's nobody at the school, there are no role models, finding a book on the shelf where you can see someone like yourself and see that there's a future can be that which keeps you alive and allows you to move forward in life. And I'd say just something else that kind of goes to, I think, Peter, what you're saying, which is the role of our schools, the role of our libraries in knitting together this pluralistic society. You know, we live overwhelmingly still in segregated communities. These are the places where we meet one another. We learn about someone unlike ourselves. A book is the key to unlock empathy. Suddenly you read a story, you're inside the head of a character who's somebody who's lived a very different life than your own, and you could see things from a different perspective, or recognize that that person on the street may have had a tough life experiences, and that's why they're treating you the way that they do. And so that the free flow of ideas and stories in our schools, in our libraries, in the shelves of our publishing houses and bookstores, I think is absolutely crucial. We don't want a world where heavy-handed legislators are dictating every book that can be read, or even where teachers are saying, you know, these are the half dozen books to read. We want a world full of shelves where you can pick and choose, whether it's Amy Coney Barrett or Mike Pence or Ketanji Brown Jackson, whoever you want to read about, whatever life story is going to inspire you, that you have a chance of finding that, whatever ideas are going to captivate you or challenge you, that you can explore those. That's, I think, an underpinning of democracy and of our kind of freewheeling society, artistic freedom, scientific progress. And so that's, to me, what's at stake when we defend against book bans.
Peter, will you bring us home? You've got the last word.
It says 1 minute and 51 seconds. I'm just going to read something, if
Please
you
do.
don't mind.
Go ahead.
All right? Because you asked us to be concise, and so I wrote it down. So the threat to democracy is human dysfunction. Let's face it. We can't help the fact that democracy is inherently divisive. That's the way it's made. We have to know how to manage democracy by using tactics and sort of strategic belief. You know, there are two people who are always quoted. One is Yogi Berra, and the other one is Winston Churchill. And Churchill actually said this: many forms of government have been tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. He said that in November of 1947. Yes, our democracy is, at the moment, in some state of disarray, dysfunction. But it is the democracy that we must somehow believe in. And when we hear the despairing that we hear so much of, I think we lose sight of the fact that there is a democracy that's worth supporting and believing in. And books obviously are essential to that, and good books are essential to that. And when somebody tells you you can't read it, God damn it, go out and read it. That's what you can do. And we can do that in the way we vote and the way we put positions into play, which Penn and ACLU and everybody does so well. It's one of the greatnesses of our democracy. So there.
Do not despair the imperfect democracy, essentially. It's all we've got. I want to thank our incredible panel again. This was a huge conversation. You did very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our first three panels, excellent as they all were very grounded in the here and now and in this political moment. This panel will be that to some extent, but it's also going to be the complete opposite of that in many ways, because we're going to talk about some history, we're going to talk about some political science, and we're going to be imaginative about democracy's better future and how we can do democracy better. So I want to start like this. We all went to school. We were all taught about American democracy and how it was built and what its principles were. And we all just assumed that that's what democracy was, because that's what it was to us when we were kids. But is it? There are a lot of democracies out there in the world. They do it differently. They have a lot of different systems. They have a lot of different ways they elect people. They have a lot of different principles upon which they're built. So we're going to try to talk about that sort of thing a little bit tonight. So here, I want to begin like this with David Daley, who is the author of Rat Effed. I won't say it, but I don't know how you got that published, but I read the book and I've reviewed the book, and it's a fantastic book, and he's a real expert on these things. So let me start with David, and then we'll go down the line to Michael Lee, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, who's just a fantastic expert on all these things, and Eddie Glaude from Princeton, the Professor of African American Studies, whom I'm sure you all know, whom I saw on Morning Joe this morning wearing that tie. Have you taken it off at all? Or? I'm so grateful you're all here. Why do we have a two-party system in the United States? Not everybody has a two-party system. Is it written in stone that a democracy has to have a two-party system? David Daley, tell people what Duverger's law is.
Duverger's law. I am glad I have a political science degree. And my 11-year-old son is here, whose birthday it is today, who was waiting for his dad to talk about Duverger's law. That's how everybody lives the dream of spending their birthday, right? Duverger was a French political scientist, and really what he recognized is that the system in which we vote becomes the strongest influence on the number of parties that you have in a democracy. So in turn, really that also shapes the very essence of representation. And so in a plurality, winner-takes-all system like our own, particularly the way that we elect our Congress and state legislatures around the country from single-member districts, really what that ends up leading to when you have a winner-takes-all system is that people become nervous about not voting for one of the two major parties because, as we've seen, whether in Florida in 2000 or whether we saw in Iowa and New Hampshire with folks trying to elbow Republicans out of the race, what you might do is end up helping elect somebody who you like the least by voting for the person who you like the most. And so the nature of our system in many ways leads to fewer parties. It makes it harder to translate support into seats in a winner-takes-all system like that. If you have 50% plus one, or sometimes less than that, right, you end up with 100% of the seats and of the power. And so when you combine Duverger's law with Elbridge Gerry's law, especially the way that Elbridge Gerry's operatives these days are able to work, and you can combine single-member winner-takes-all districts drawn to ensure that one party wins, you distort the nature of representation even more.
Michael E., do you think that having a strict two-party system as we do exacerbates political polarization at all, or do you think that's due to other factors?
Well, I think it can. I mean, I'm not sure I buy the fact that we have two parties. Part of it is also how we nominate the candidates, right? We, in our country, we use primaries. Primaries tend to be very low turnout affairs. And because of gerrymandering, the primary is oftentimes the decisive race, right? Right now, there are only about 24 races that are rated as true toss-ups out of 435 in the House. And, you know, a few more if you add in the leans, but really not a lot is competitive. So for most of us, including in Brooklyn where I live, you know, the primary is the deciding race, and we know for a fact that, you know, primary electorates in both parties, but particularly in the Republican Party, tend to be very much more extreme on issues. And if that's who you're going for, then, you know, that's sort of, you know, they're the deciders, and the rest of us are just along for the ride. And so, you know, that I think it can influence it. You know, I think part of it also is, you know, I have my own thesis that, you know, a lot of the polarization in our country is driven by the fact that 40% of the country now lives in the South, right? The South is the largest region in the country. You know, if you go back to 1950, at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, the South, the Northeast, and the Midwest were all about the same size. The South has just grown explosively. It continues to grow. In last year, 100% of the growth of the country was in the South. 4 states, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida, account for 90% of the population gains in the country. And the South is just a very different country within a country. So I do think like having more choices might be a good thing. I think why we, you know, but I think the polarization question is a little complicated.
Certainly. Eddie, what are your thoughts here?
Ditto.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a delight to be here with you guys. The conversation has been wonderful, and so I'm really, really honored to be a part of it. I think we also just need to add another element. What happens when corporate capture? How do we think about the role of money and how it makes it very difficult to differentiate what the two parties stand for, when in fact we could easily make certain sorts of claims that although there's certain sorts of differences that could be identified between two parties, but there's underlying similarities in relation to their response to corporate money and corporation interest and aims and the like. And that can have a distorting effect on the way in which democracy functions, the way in which representation happens, right? So outsized money and its influence can distort the way in which two parties can function. And if you don't have other options, then you're caught.
I want to raise another issue that people who talk about this subject sometimes talk about. The size of our House of Representatives. Any of you ever given this any thought? It's 435. You know how long it's been 435? A little bit more than a century. It expanded from 1789 through 1920-ish. Dave knows the exact year, I'm sure. With censuses, because that's what the Constitution said it should do. It should grow. It hasn't grown since the 1920s. A member of parliament in Britain represents about 100,000, 110,000 constituents. A member of the United States House of Representatives represents about 700,000. A lot of people think we should expand the size of the House of Representatives. Talk about this, David, and tell people why that might make a difference.
Sure. I think that when you have gone that long without increasing the size of the House, what we've done really is change the essence of representation. Right now, it's really, I think it's even higher than 700,000. I think it's something like 730, 740,000 in some of these districts. And what we have seen in Washington over the course, I mean, I think especially of these last few years, is that it is very difficult to get any new blood, any generational change in Congress. And I think much of that has to do with the fact that we haven't changed the number of members of the House in over a century. You combine that with the institutional advantages of incumbency and campaign finance and redistricting, and you get stuck really quick. I think if what we want to do is open up the system, and really open up the system in every way to various political ideologies, but also to demographic groups that are currently shortchanged and underrepresented. What we really need to do is think about the size of that body.
Can I just add something there? I do think, like Dave hit on something that I think is very important, which is, if you're talking about drawing districts under the Voting Rights Act to give communities of color the ability to elect and participate in the process, it's really hard to meet the legal requirements if you have to draw a district that is majority, in the majority, half of 760,000, right? It's really hard. And so, and that's particularly the case in the nation's suburbs, where, a majority of Americans, 55% of all Americans live in the suburbs, including a majority of people of color in the metro areas now. And it's really hard to draw a compact majority district in those areas. And so there's no legal liability. And as a result, these fast-growing communities of color in places like Fort Bend County, Texas, or Gwinnett County, Georgia, just get left on the sideline. And so having a bigger House would make it easier to enforce the Voting Rights Act, and to make sure that everyone is there, and that we have sort of a House that, John Adams talked at the founding of the country about how Congress and legislature should be an exact portrait, in a miniature of the people as a whole. And that's really hard to do if you're having these gigantic sized districts and across a number of dimensions.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, underlying the question is the House of Representatives a representative body?
Representative, yeah.
And I think the answer to the question is no. And the answer to the question is no, not only because of its arrested size, it's also because of political factors that have led to gerrymandering and a whole range of things, that it is not a representative body. It's dysfunctional. Not only dysfunctional in the way we see and the way we've seen, but in just the very ways in which it goes about constituting itself every 2 years. And I think that question and the answers to it take us to the heart of whether or not representative democracy in the United States is actually that, it seems to me.
Well, that seems like a good segue into talking about the United States Senate.
Oh yeah, that's democracy at work.
But the problem is that the Senate cannot be changed.
Sure it can.
How?
Well, Article 5 says you can't amend the Constitution, but it says nothing about a statute. It says nothing about the great Senate Reform Reapportionment Act of 2024 that we ought to be at work on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Michael?
Well, I think one idea for the Senate that some people have kicked around, like, you can't, Constitution guarantees every state equal representation. It says you can't change that, right? That's the only entrenched clause in the Constitution.
Correct.
But you could increase the size of the Senate, say give every state 4 seats, right? That would double the size of the Senate, still would only be 200 people, so a relatively small body. And you could change the election so that all 4 senators from the state are elected at the same time by proportional representation. And so if you had that kind of system, Wyoming would elect at least 1 Democrat, New York would at least elect at least 1 Republican. You could still have staggered, elections every 2 years, so a third of the Senate is up. A third of the states have Senate elections every 2 years. But you could, there's a lot that you could do within that. And while having a Senate, you could just make that our PR chamber and have single-member districts. And we can talk about whether they're alternative single-member districts in a minute. But, you could have the Senate be a pure PR chamber, which, I think has a lot of benefits. I mean, right now, Democrats in Wyoming are shut out. Like, they could get 1 seat. They're consistently a quarter of the vote.
I've thought a lot about this. I don't know what to do with the Senate, except, the British had this problem with the House of Lords in the early 1900s. And what they did was they just took power away from the House of Lords. Eddie, what would you do? What do you think the problem is with our Senate?
The Senate?
Yeah.
No, but I understand the quandary that the early founders confronted, right? How do we ensure that less populous states aren't just run over by the more populated states? I understand, Federalist 68, right? That leads to the Electoral College and the like. I understand the rationale behind it, right? Because we don't want, it's simply the case that, the East Coast and the West Coast and now the South, right, dictating, right, the direction of the country. But we have to think about this in a way, in such a way that democracy is actually functioning, where you don't have a kind of quote unquote, at least this is the phrase that is being bandied about these days, a kind of virtuous minority running the damn country, right? And I know at least 2 things, and we'll get to this, at least 2 things, the way the Senate functions and the Electoral College functions actually get in the way of genuine representative democracy in the country.
Yeah, let's...
You also could get rid of the filibuster, right? You could also change the sort of unanimous consent rule. So there's a lot of stuff that is within the power of the Senate itself to make the Senate work better, even without doing more.
We're segueing, just 1 second, Dave, we're segueing into the next category of thing that I wanted to talk about. The scholars call these choke points, the choke points in our Constitution that were meant to slow down the process of making legislation, that were meant to cool the hot saucer of tea, as they put it in those days. But there are too many, and with the way things are now, the choke points are really choking us. What are the worst choke points?
I think it's that the choke points are choking us, but also that the choke points have been weaponized in such a way that they are enabling not a virtuous minority, but a genuine minority rule in many ways. We've talked this evening about state legislatures and about the U.S. Supreme Court, but I think we've hit on something here with the U.S. Senate. 2/3 of us live in the largest 15 states, and so we have 30 senators. That breaks down to 22 Democrats and 8 Republicans. 1/3 of us live in the other 35 states and have 70 senators. Breaks down to 42 Republicans and 28 Democrats. So when you add the filibuster into that, those 42 can be a choke point of their own. I think in the middle of the Voting Rights Act, a debate, Senator King from Maine said that what the filibuster did was it gave virtual veto power to folks representing 24% of the nation. And that 24% of the nation is far whiter and more rural than the rest of the nation. It does not accurately reflect America.
Mine is the Electoral College.
Yeah.
I think we just need to abolish it finally. And it has a lot to do with in my view, how can I put this in a direct way? Given the nature of presidential elections and how close they are and will be and will continue to be, given the impact downstream of gerrymandered districts and the way in which inequality maps onto red states and blue states, given the way in which we're seeing these distinctions, we're facing, I think, a legitimation crisis in the country around our electoral process, right? And what I mean by that is that more and more Americans of all stripes are distrustful of outcomes. When candidates are winning the popular vote and losing the election, then they lose trust and faith in the system, right? And we see this downstream in a number of different ways in terms of just simply the execution of the vote. I mean, right now, I believe, and this is just a footnote, we were worried about the outcome of the 2024 election. I was talking to Michael about this. We need to be worried about whether, if Trump loses, whether folk accept the outcome, right? That's just an aside. We have a legitimation crisis, and I'm not just invoking Habermas here, but we have a legitimation crisis that's cutting all the way down. And it seems to me that we need to figure out, right, well, we need to rid ourselves of the Electoral College, which is in some ways deeply skeptical of the power of the demos, right? Not only do we need to do it because of that, we also need to do it because of the threat of faithless electors who might not follow the will of their states and do whatever they want to do. And given our experience with Trumpism, that seems highly plausible in our current moment as a strategy. And when you look at those political actors who are committed to the Electoral College and those who want to abolish it, it actually falls along party lines in interesting sorts of ways. So it's one of the choke points, it seems to me, in terms of actual workings of democracy itself. I have so much more to say about that. And we almost abolished it in 1934 and in 1979.
Yeah. Michael?
I agree with all of that. I do think the Electoral College might work better if you just sort of allocated the electors proportionally, right? If Democrats get 48% of the vote in Texas, they get 48% of the state's electors. So, but I overall favor abolishing the Electoral College for the many other reasons stated. I guess the two I mentioned already are the Senate and the filibuster, right, which are big choke points that give like a small minority outsized, veto power and figuring out what to do there. I also think functionally the courts have become sort of a very anti-democratic choke point, right? You pass things and the courts are very skeptical and they sort of don't allow, the popular will, right? And there's sort of, I don't quite, the courts play an important role, of course, as a check and balance in our system, but the problem is you have sometimes dishonest courts putting a hold on things, and so that is a choke point of a different.
Now the fun part. We're getting down to close to 6 minutes left, and I want to ask you this. You have a magic wand. You can reshape American democracy as you wish from the ground up. What kind of democracy would you build? Would you have a unicameral system, a bicameral system, a presidential system, a parliamentary system? How would the courts be arranged? You don't have forever. And I want you, at the end of your answer, to append it with, having said all that, here's one thing that I'd like us to do that I think we could do in the next 5 to 10 years. So each of you has about 2 minutes. Go.
2 minutes. Let's do it. I think the key words that we want to think about are proportional and equitable and responsive. I think what we want to design are legislatures in which a majority of citizens with a majority of votes can change the essence of their leadership. And what we have right now at all levels of our politics, whether we're talking about the Electoral College, whether we're talking about the US Senate or the Congress, or state legislatures, or a judiciary, frankly, right, in which 5 of the 9 conservative justices have been appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote and then confirmed by a US Senate that lacks any real connection to the public will. So what I think we need to think about would be the kind of U.S. Senate reforms, thinking seriously, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said 35 years ago, that there is going to be a legitimacy problem in the U.S. Senate over the course of the next century. That time is here now. That we also have to think really seriously about what we do with single-member districts in the U.S. House. That if we were to think about a system that was more multi-member districts, more proportional, what that might do to increase and re-incentivize our politics and try and take it back so that the virtuous or unvirtuous minority do not have that kind of chokehold over our politics. So some combination of multi-member districts and ranked choice voting there. Something that we can do super quick, I think, would be to go after ranked choice voting for any election that has more than 2 people running in it, so that what we are able to get back to is something closer to majority rule. This is especially important in so many places where primaries are the key, and folks can win seats from gerrymandered districts in Congress with about 20% of the vote in a low turnout primary. It's not democracy.
Great. Michael?
So I have a modest proposal, which is, Dave talked about multi-member districts. I think multi-member districts are worth exploring. I think we could just do something like Germany, New Zealand, and South Korea do and have a mixed system where you have a lot of single-member districts, but you also have some share of districts that you vote for a party, right? And those are allocated proportionally, and in all those countries, they're allocated in a way that you get overall proportionality, right? So, it's a mixed system. And I think you could therefore have the benefits of single-member districts like majority-minority districts and the like that elect people, but you also could have overall proportionality, and people, I think, people have found it very easy to use, and it's sort of produced a lot of flexibility in those places. So that's my very modest proposal of a reform that's a slight variant on what Dave talked about. In terms of what people could do in the next 5 years, assuming that there is the political will, they could pass 2 pieces of legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both of which narrowly came close to passing but failed just because of the filibuster, right? There was a majority in both houses in favor. There was just not a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. The Freedom to Vote Act would adopt automatic voter registration, mandate early voting, provide for same-day registration, ban partisan gerrymandering, put curbs on a lot of dark money in politics. A big reform, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would restore and strengthen the protections of the Voting Rights Act that have been gutted by the Supreme Court. So those are my answers.
Terrific.
I don't tend to think this way. So I think underneath this is a kind of, underneath both imagineering, as it were, I think we need to understand the kind of moral backdrop of democracy itself. And I think we need to articulate what is our social compact, what are our obligations to each other. I think if we're going to live in a democracy, however it looks, we need to affirm that every human being, if they're going to work, they can earn a living wage. That our commitment to each other is that our child, no matter where they're born, no matter what the color of their skin, no matter their neighborhood, they're going to get the best education they could possibly get. That every one of us deserves a house over our head, that we don't need to lose our way of life or our ability to live because we're sick. We need to understand a social compact that articulates, no matter the color of your skin or your race or your class or your gender or who you love, these are our obligations to each other, and build a system that reflects that. The last thing I would think we need to do, we need to figure out how to connect the metropole to the rural, to these rural communities. We need to figure out how to integrate our community, not necessarily by a narrative of consensus, but by infrastructure. So that if I live in a rural community, I can get on high-speed rail and make my way to a city and have a nice job, go do something. We need to figure out how to connect the country, and that we need to think about that at a certain level. But the first thing we need to do is get clear on the moral basis of our living together so that we can live together differently and more profoundly.
How about that? And that's how we end. Okay. Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you all. to say what you can do to save democracy right now. I see everybody's getting their coats on and gets up and wants to go, and you don't want to listen to me. But I'm just gonna. But just give me 40 seconds, okay? I'm not going to give you a big long list of things you should go volunteer for. You can figure that out. I'm just going to say this. You cannot pretend in this day and age that the actions of one person don't matter. You can't pretend that. The last two presidential elections, this entire country, 150, 160-something million people voting, have been decided by 77,000 people and 43,000 people. You can't pretend that you should stay home. You just can't pretend that anymore. Everybody, every action we take matters. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for listening.